I was born in San Francisco in the Mission District. In fact, at that time it was called the Excelsior, which is the outer Mission. And the neighborhood would be comparable to the Lower East Side here in New York. And when I was 5, we were fortunate enough to move out to the beach. And at that time, the beach and the area out there wasn't developed. It later became what is known now as the Sunset District. But there weren't any blacktop roads. In fact, there was only one big street that went down to the sand dunes, which was called Taravel, Lavarette spelled backwards. And the dunes were endless, and there were only 2 or 3 houses within 3 or 4 square miles. And the family that was closest to us, not adjacent, there was a sand dune in between, was the DeSuvro family. And I have one really clear, recurring recollection of that time in my life. I was about 6 years old, and I used to get into continuous mischief. And my mother had no way of making me behave, and she wasn't a very strict disciplinarian. But my father had his own ideas about how to bring up his sons. And when I would do something wrong, my father would come home, and he would take me out the back door and point to the horizon. And there weren't any fences, there was just endless miles of sand dunes. And he would pick out a square shovel, and he would say, "See that mound there?" And I'd say, "Which one?" And he'd say, "The one there." And I'd say, "Oh, you mean the one about 30 yards away?" He said, "Yes, that one. I would like you to move it over there, where the knoll is." And I'd say, "Where the knoll is where?" And he'd say, "Where the knoll is 40 yards to the left." Now, some days there would be large windstorms, not storms, but large winds would occur, and so the sand would actually shift around and the knoll wouldn't be exactly where it was the following day. But my father was very clear that he wanted one mound moved from one part of the terrain to the other. And he would ask me to move it by the time he got home that evening. And I wasn't very discouraged about having to face the day of moving all that sand. In fact, there was a certain rhythm I would get into in doing it. And I found after a while that there was no necessity to actually shovel the dirt. You just put the scoop in and drag the shovel from one side to the other rather than shoveling it. And then just turn the shovel over. So I spent hours walking back and forth with these shovels full of dirt. Then my father would come home and would stand on the same stoop and would look out at what the day's chore had accomplished. And he would say, "Do you think it's in the right place?" And I would think about it for a long time, and I would say, "I don't know, what do you think?" And he'd say, "I think you can move it 30 yards to the right by tomorrow." And this procedure sometimes would go on for 6 or 7 days till he and I decided that what I was doing was making us both feel better about each other. And what I finally decided about my father was that if I thought his idea for me to move that dirt around was just, I would have moved that dirt anywhere.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to DIA. My name is Matilde Guidelli. I'm a curator here, and I had the pleasure to work with Electronic Art Intermix and organize the exhibition of film and videos by Richard Serra that is closed today, and with a very special lecture by Chrissie Iles. I wish to thank everyone who helped us make the exhibition possible, our colleagues at DAI and DIA, Rebecca, Carl, Kelly, Jo Young, Kim, Max, Emily, Ella, and Fernando, the MoMA Film Department, Katie Traynor, and Peter Alexis in particular, Trina McKeever and Caroline Gabrielli at Richard Serra Studio, Sarah Jones at Gagosian, and Clara Weiergraf Serra most especially. The impetus for our focused attention on Serra's films and videos is twofold: to celebrate EAI's distribution of his moving image work, and to jointly honor the memory of Serra with a lesser-known part of his practice. What we just saw on the screen was Richard Serra in a clip from Jean Dupuy's 1974 Soup and Tart, a video shot by Babette Mangold, Mary Lucier, and Tina Girouard, and produced by Carlotta Schoolman on an evening of performances held at the Kitchen. The video is a time capsule of the art and music scene in the lower Manhattan of the early 70s, and that night, Serra had a friend read a story about his own childhood in San Francisco. He was living at the beach at the time, and sand dunes marked his horizon. He was a mischievous child, so his father assigned him a daily task: to move a certain sand dune from one part of the terrain to another by the time he returned from work. Rather than resenting the task, Serra found a certain rhythm in performing the action, in scooping the sand, dragging it, and turning it over for hours at a time. "Do you think it is in the right place?" his father would ask when he got home. "I don't know, what do you think?" the child would say, to which his father responded, "I think you can move it a little bit to the right." After the procedure continued for several days, Serra realized that the task was meant to make father and son feel better about each other, and that he would have moved the sand anywhere. This autopoietic account summarizes one of Serra's most important contributions to the history of art: to recast sculpture as an action to be repeatedly carried through, think of the verb list, all the while probing the relation between form and action and what it takes to initiate action. And the latter question, what it takes to initiate action, he most explicitly addressed in his moving image work between 1968 and 1979, that looked at the physiology of muscle reflex, hand catching lead, at the structures of communication systems, of mass media, justice, the art world, automated infrastructure, and finally labor organizing. Projected here are Serra's Tort ellipses, probably his most astounding sculptural form, the first of which were commissioned by Dia in the mid-90s for an exhibition here in Chelsea, and that are now on permanent view at Dia Beacon, thanks to the patronage of Leonard Riggio, whose recent passing we also wish to honor today. Their scale is more than can be fully apprehended, and their materiality attracts a bodily engagement that is entirely their own. They provoke something akin to what Nancy Holt describes in Boomerang, a constantly revolving, involuting experience. Chrissie Iles is the Anne and Joel Ehrenkrantz curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Her curated exhibitions include surveys of Louise Bourgeois, Dan Graham, and Sharon Hayes, as well as 4 major thematic exhibitions of moving image art, including Into the Light, the Projected Image in American Art, 1964 to 1977, and Dreamlands, Immersive Cinema and Art, 1905 to 2016. Chrissie has co-curated the 2004, 2006, and 2024 Whitney Biennials. Alongside her exemplary exhibition making, Chrissie builds the Whitney's permanent collection of time-based media and has authored numerous exhibition publications. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Chrissie Iles on Richard Serra's films and videos.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Matilde, for that great introduction. And I'd also like to thank Clara, Sarah, and Trina in Richard's studio. And thank you to Dia for inviting me to give this lecture on Richard's films and videos. It's an honor to remember Richard in this way. Richard's such a major figure in the history of art in America and beyond. And his passing really marks the end of a period in American sculpture that we're only just beginning to process. Why was cinema so important to Richard? And why, as an artist so grounded in materiality, matter, form, density, gravity, weight, and physical space, why did he make this group of films and videotapes during the period from 1968 to 79? So maybe some general context first for that period. During the 60s and 70s, the moving image played a really critical role in creating a new language of representation, and artists were picking up the camera left and right. Even those artists you wouldn't have thought would use the camera, like Roy Lichtenstein, for example, and they were using film, video, slides, holographic and photographic projection to measure, document, abstract, perform, temporalize and transform the parameters of physical and sculptural space as well as the image. And then, the ways in which they were investigating the perceptual and temporal implications of sculptural space was through a kind of dismantling of its central gestalt that the moving image is so brilliant at being able to do. So Richard's films and videos, which were all made during this intense period of experimentation, were very specific. Richard firmly stated over and over again that he began to make his sculpture and his films and videos at the same time, and that his films and videos were not extensions of sculptural problems, but they were separate and independent works that demand a different kind of attention from the viewer. His engagement with cinema and his regular attendance at screenings at anthology film archives, for example, really exposed him to experimental films and independent films of all kinds from the 1920s to the then present. But his understanding of cinema was also deepened by his close friendships with experimental filmmakers Didi Halleck, Michael Snow, Babette Mangold, and Robert Fiore. Bob Fiore shot all of Richard's films except Railroad Tunbridge, which was shot by Didi Halleck. And so Bob is behind the camera in every film you see. And this is important to note, because as a result, Richard's films are constructed with the technical expertise and craft of filmmaking that Bob Fiore and Didi had. Despite each film's simplicity, therefore, unlike the home movie quality of the Super 8 films that so many artists were making, there is nothing of the sketch or the gesture about Richard's films. So where did this cinematic attention of Richard's come from? Well, again, a little bit of context in New York City. Richard arrived in New York in 1966 after a Fulbright scholarship in Paris, where French New Wave cinema with experimental forms were in full swing, and Richard regularly visited the Paris Cinematheque. And he began to watch, as I mentioned, experimental films in all the temporary cinemas across New York City that Jonas Mekas, a filmmaker and poet, was screening them at. And like other cities in America during this period, of course, New York was in a state of turmoil. It was roiled by racial inequality, political instability, violence, the Vietnam War, urban blight, and the assassination of Kennedy and Martin Luther King. The seeds of the 1920s avant-garde experiments of European artists in film and other mediums that had been shut down by the Nazi regime and the Second World War were also really regerminating for the first time in a very intense way. And so the cinemas across the city that were in a state of flux, some closing, some opening, were also reflecting that in what they showed. So on the screen here, we can see the Film Arts Guild Cinema from 1929. This is one of the cinemas Richard went to. It was designed by the Viennese architect and theatre designer Frederick Kiesler, and he built it in 1929 at 52 West 8th Street, just near 6th Avenue. It was the first and only cinema of its kind in the US, and it was a venue for independent and experimental films until it closed in 1991. So until 91, you could have seen films here. The walls were dark blue, left and right, and the silver ceiling above. They were all angled towards sort of inwards to meet the screen, which was covered by, as you can see, two retractable coverings like a cat's eye or the aperture of a camera. Mechanical panels could also adjust the size and shape of the screen, and additional projectors in the ceiling could project other images onto the side walls, as you can see that diagram of below, and the ceiling could also be another screen. Kiesler was a member of the Dutch Distill Art Group and saw light as a powerful medium for these sorts of experiments with projection and architecture, and most of the films first screened there were silent. So he called his new cinema the House of Shadow Silence. Just want to make a note that just as this was a venue in New York in the 60s, cinema was segregated in America until the mid-1960s when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation. So this is also a very important point to mention when we think about the cinematic context during this period. So what was Richard watching when he went to cinemas in New York? To get a sense of this, he made frequent visits to the cinema, as we know, with his then partner, Joan Jonas, very often. Let's look at some of the films he saw that were being shown for the first time since the Second World War in New York. And the re-emergence of these radical film experiments from the 1920s is really key to understanding the context for Richard and other artists' engagement with the moving image during this period of the 60s and 70s. And this resurfacing of moving image experiments from one historically turbulent period in the midst of another not only reminds us that artists have engaged with film since the moment it appeared, but also reveals a striking similarity between ways artists work with a moving image in both periods. Now, over in Germany, there were a lot of abstract experiments with color and form in the 1920s, not through necessarily film itself, since color film didn't exist, but through experiments like this one by Kurt Schwertfeger, Reflektorische farblich Spiel, reflecting light color play, with apologies for my terrible German accent, which he made in 1922 in Munich when he was 25 years old and a student at the Bauhaus. And he presented it in the Russian painter Vasily Kandinsky's studio in Munich. And here is the kind of background to that sort of image you saw in the darkened room. So already we can see this sort of experimental relationship between the 2 and 3 dimensions being explored through constructed moving images, in this case by building this quasi-architectural site for the image and also including live sound played by the artist at the same time that he was moving slats in and out to create moving painterly compositions with colored light gels, which echoed, of course, Kandinsky's own interest in synesthesia. Now, Richard didn't see this early experiment, as it was only rediscovered and restored recently, actually by the Whitney and by Microscope Gallery, but its painterly adjacency to the continuing inflection of painting in these experiments with intermedia in the New York environment of the 60s, in which Richard's films were made, is important, as we'll see shortly. Richard was also seeing films like Un chien andalou from 1929, the surrealist film by Buñuel and Salvador Dali, in which Buñuel's hand in this shot and the one after can be seen holding open the blankly staring eye of the French actress Simone Mareuil, then slicing it in two with a razor in extreme close-up. The artifice of this violent act is swiftly made evident by Mareuil's appearance, both eyes intact in the next scene, confirming our suspicion that what we just witnessed was not a real event, but a sleight-of-hand cinematic edit that caused the viewer involuntarily to fuse Buñuel's actual slicing of a dead cow's eye, framed by its hairy eyebrow, given definition by an eyebrow pencil, with the next shot. Félix Fanez argues that the lacerated eye in Un chien andalou is a metaphor for the replacement of the artist by the machine, the camera. For the surrealist actor and assistant director on the film, Jacques Brunius, quote, "The image of the sliced eye was the announcement of the end of the predominance of the eye in Western culture. The glistening eyes of the voyeurs of beautiful photos, the lovers of fine paintings, the sensitive of retina. The razor, in other words, is a stand-in for the camera, which is an extension of the hand that transforms the space and the sight, S-I-T-E, of visual perception. And quote, it writes a new story directly on and about the eye, about the process of seeing, as Margaret Helene Persson observes of that famous opening scene. Richard also saw the films of Soviet film director and theorist film theorist Sergei Eisenstein, films such as Battleship Potemkin. This is a group of a sequence of images from that film made in 1925. So again, we see the 1920s and having such an impact on artists, and especially Richard, for whom Eisenstein was extremely important. Eisenstein was the most significant director to emerge from the October Revolution, and his 1929 essay in film theory, Film Form, discussed montage and, quoting Eisenstein here, the relationship of the object placed in front of the camera. A chord in music, Eisenstein said, is understood as an organic unit. Why should the combination of three pieces of film in montage, one after the other, be considered as a threefold collision? Three successive images. A blue tone is mixed with a red tone, and the result is thought of as violet, not as a double exposure of red and blue. Eisenstein also wrote that the shot, considered as a material for the purpose of composition, is more resistant than granite. This resistance has largely determined the richness and variety of montage forms and styles. He also talked of the cinematographic conflicts within the frame as conflict of graphic directions, of scales, of volumes, of masses, volumes filled with various intensities of light, conflicts of depth, conflicts between an object and its dimension, and between an object and its duration. And he described this framing as hewing out a piece of actuality with the axe of the lens. Eisenstein's words are important for Richard's thinking about his own approach to his filmmaking. He rejected descriptions of his films as sculptural films, which many people would try to describe them as, underlining their distinctness from his sculptures, and really wanted us to think about them in their own right. His approach to their making has a materiality, however, that resonates with Eisenstein's analysis. So, where did Richard see Eisenstein's films? He saw them at Anthology Film Archives, which was the place he frequented most. At 80 Worcester Street in Soho, not the gentrified place it is now, and it's about a block and a half from where his studio was on Grand Street. Soho at that moment was known as Hell's 100 Acres because of its desolate abandoned buildings, dark streets with no street lights, trash, neglect, and crime. Jonas created Anthology Film Archives in the first Flux House Artist Cooperative established by George Maciunas, and the New York Cinematheque, as it was first known, in a direct reference to the Paris Cinematheque Richard had frequented and to which Mikas was closely connected, became a key element to the artistic community that emerged downtown there during the late 60s and which Richard was a part of. So the New York Cinematheque, aka Anthology Film Archives, was a space for cross-disciplinary experimentation and dialogue, creating a portal for artists to explore not only cinema, but new forms of other time-based work in performance, dance, poetry, within an expansive framework of cinema. Jonas Mikas was a catalyst, connecting artists, filmmakers, dancers, and writers, and dispersing the cinematic into a collaborative, rhizomatic praxis, provisional, dialogical, and in a constant state of transformation. I would argue that Mikas' ability to operate in this rhizomatic way was because he was a poet first, and his engagement with a cinema that was provisional and that must be continuously transformed in order to stay alive, is rooted in the creation of non-cinematographic cinematic forms by artists, writers, and poets across Russia and Europe in the 20s, right up to the 50s, as a resistance to, quote, the emerging condition of universal mediation brought on by the cultural ubiquity of cinema, as Pavle Levi observed. As Levi argues, this opposition to the recalibration of the imaginary as technological, cinema being in our heads and Hollywood, interesting relationship to social media now, involved separating cinema from its materiality and allowing it to function as other forms, like this one. In the early 1950s, lettrist, artist, and poet Isidore Isu, that we see here, treated the medium of cinema to the logic of general convertibility. It inaugurated a series of purely conceptual shifts with which he granted each of the existing mediums the right to function as another. as Levi argued. This release of the imaginary from the shackles of technological determinism echoed the experiments of numerous writers and artists in the 1920s, for whom writing was understood as a form of cinematic praxis. So back to anthology film archives, what would you see there? What did Richard see there? Well, so cinema and the Eisenstein films and everything else that Richard and others were watching there was also contextualized by other very different events, like Nam June Paik's Fluxus performance, for example, here. Richard Foreman play, Sophia Wisdom Part 3, The Cliffs. Jonas had asked the young theatre director, Richard Foreman, to coordinate all the non-film events there. And so he booked dance and experimental music and performance and produced 4 of his own ontological hysteric theatre plays there. Shigego Kupota, video artist and curator, was invited to create video programs at 80 Worcester Street and artist talks, and this is a detail of a poster for a Video Freaks event at 80 Worcester Street storefront window with 525 videotapes running every day for a month from 1 p.m. to 2 a.m., and there they are all listed. Richard's then partner Joan Jonas not only attended film screenings at Anthology, but also performed there. Mirage, which you can see here, was designed specifically for the Cinematheque screening room, and she performed it in front of a film she'd made, projected on the screen behind her, as you can see, with a pre-recorded video playing on a monitor turned on its side, as well as drawings on the floor. So this is one of Joan's earliest sort of performance moving image works. Richard also attended his close friend Philip Glass and Steve Reich's performance of Philip Glass's In Again, Out Again at 80 Worcester Street on 19th of May, 1968, an image of it here, with musical scores, as you can see, pinned around the room, and the musicians moved around to play them. Jonas Meekers' openness to presenting works like this as a cinema that also contains the non-cinematic, inspired artists to respond to the space and produce new kinds of non-cinematic forms, which in turn reframed the films that were screened there. Also, just to mention the larger environment close by, the kitchen, founded in 1971 by video artists Steiner and Woody Vasilka. Artist space, first location was 155 Worcester Street above Paulo Cooper Gallery. Here's a poetry reading by Jennifer Bartlett as part of a film and video screening there. And Ornette Coleman, 2 blocks away from that, Ornette Coleman moved into 131 Prince Street in 1968, buying shares in the co-op for 2 floors, where he remained for 6 years. And he named the loft the Artist's House, and it became a site of a range of concerts, rehearsals, and events with friends and fellow musicians, including Don Cherry, Ed Blackwell, and Charlie Hayden. It was also his living space, and he collaborated with experimental electronic composer Emmanuel Gent, who lived on the 5th floor. So this is just the general context within which all of this is occurring and within which Richard's films were made just a couple of blocks away. This is Rodchenko, just to jump back to the 1920s, non-objective painting number 80, Black on Black from 1918. And it's important to note that in this cultural moment I'm sketching out, painting still dominated, the shadow of abstract expressionist painting in particular. And Richard understood this well. And his work appeared, and he appeared on the scene as its power was waning and new thinking about space was emerging. But key to understanding Richard's films is the fact that he regarded sculpture as being as marginal as other non-painting mediums. He said, quote, "There's no audience for sculpture, as there is not for poetry or experimental film. There's a big audience for products, paintings, which give people what they want and supposedly need, and which do not attempt to give them more than they understand. No one demands that sculpture or poetry resist manipulation from the outside. I think that sculpture, if it has any potential at all, has the potential to create its own space and place." For Richard, when his commitment to sculpture began, sculpture and film were equally marginal in the larger scheme of the art world. And that's precisely what gave them their power. So as the traces of abstract expressionist painting were rapidly being metabolized and transformed through a new sculptural, filmic, and photographic language, and some of those earlier generation painters, such as Frank Stella and Jasper Johns, lived close to Richard and his peers downtown, and were a known part of that community. The impact of Soviet art of the 1920s on the new generation of American artists, as we've seen, was strong. Just as Richard was watching Eisenstein and Vertov films, in 1971, MoMA presented the first Rodchenko exhibition outside the Soviet Union, including this work, which is now in their collection, and Hanging Construction from 1921. Rodchenko was pushing two-dimensional paintings into three-dimensional space, using, quote, the materials of a geometer and house painter, compass, ruler, enamel-based pigments, rollers, stencils, and sandpaper, to ground painting in its physical material properties. This is Aldo Tambellini's Black Zero from 1965 to 68. So as a bit of further context for the traces of the ways in which painting operated as a seed for the new material forms that Richard's films embody, in 1965, the year after the Civil Rights Act abolishing segregation was brought into law, and a year of uprisings all over the country, including New York, Aldo Tambellini created a collaborative multimedia performance titled Black Zero, performed on East 2nd Street in the East Village. He did it in collaboration with experimental jazz musician and composer Alan Silver and Bill Dixon, dancers Carla Blank and Lorraine Boyd, members of the anarchist anti-art group Black Mask, poets Calvin C. Herndon, Ishmael Reed, Norman Pritchard, and other Umbra poets, in an environment of painting and projection, slides, film, poetry, and music, which was described as space-light sound, to echo Kiesler's 1929 project. Nadia Larson describes this as a convergence of new technologies with new social movements, in particular that of the Black Power movement emerging out of the Civil Rights movement and the emerging Black Arts movement, and the hypervisibility of those shifts in television and the media. Tambellini's desire to break out of the conventions of modernist painting, which continued until 1968 and beyond, echoed Richard's own. But for Richard, the studio was the private site of experimentation, and its architectural structure the frame. This is not Richard's studio, but it's an example of studios in Soho when artists came to them. They had nothing. They didn't have bathrooms. They didn't have electricity. They were extremely rough spaces, and this is just a reminder that it wasn't always Nike, which we know, but just if you take a look at the rawness of these spaces, it actually gives you a very important understanding of the role of the studio at this moment in the 60s. Large open spaces, rough wooden floors, tin ceilings, large windows, brick walls, no heat, electricity wired by the artists themselves, in locations written off as urban blight. And the radical possibilities this offered was really kind of paradoxical in a sense, because many artists were overlaying domestic space onto the space of the studio, fusing together two worlds that had traditionally been kept separate. Until the 60s, the avant-garde had been defined by its distance from domesticity, home, and a private familial space, to which the camera was also, at least until the kind of 1940s, deemed to belong. In the crisis of the studio that took place in the 60s, its role nevertheless, therefore, remained potent, because of course the studio is where all Richard Serra's hand films were made. Even though many artists left the studio for the street, the land, the road, the rooftop, buildings around the city, or other spaces such as the cinema, the dancer's studio, they also returned to it. And the relationship between the studio, where artists often gathered to see each other performing, the street, the cinema, and the gallery space, became porous in a way that has not occurred before or since. So the paradox of the studio during this period was how important it remained as a creative space, even as its traditional role was being dismantled. Between 1968 and 1969, when Richard was making his hand films, he made nearly 100 works that involved the manipulation of lead. In 1967, as Matilde mentioned, he had written down a series of transitive verbs: to roll, to crease, to splash, to spill. And he was enacting those verbs. As Douglas Crimp explains, these were grouped together with nouns such as of tension, of gravity, of entropy, of equilibrium. Serra's pieces, Splashing and Casting, were both made by throwing molten lead at the space where the wall met the floor. So what we're looking at is the Whitney Museum up in the Broy building, and the now iconic exhibition Anti-Illusion, Procedures, Materials, which was co-curated in 1969 by Marcia Tucker and James Monti, in which Richard was included. He repeatedly flung molten lead against the wall where it met the Whitney's stone floor, and then methodically, ladleful by ladleful, created long lines, and then waited for them to harden, then pulled each long hardened form into the space 12 times, as you can see here, multiplying the space between the wall and the floor like film frames. Here we see Richard with Jasper Johns in 1969. So Jasper Johns visited the show and was so taken by Richard's work there that he asked him if he'd be willing to create a smaller version of it for his studio on Houston Street near Richard on Grand Street, which he did. And so here we can see Jasper Johns helping Richard, holding up the metal sheet against which the lead cast is being formed, and you can see one of his own paintings on the wall behind. In yet another example of the subtle threads interweaving painting and sculpture that mark John's own work and that period within these cinematic experiments were forged. Hand-catching lead, 1968. So as we know, Richard's first films consist of a single repetitive gesture performed by his hand or hands in the studio, filmed close-up in a single take by his friend, filmmaker Bob Fiore, with whom he'd been in Paris. Bob also shot Smithson's Spiral Jetty, Robert Morris's Finch College Project, and many other films for other artists, as well as being a noted filmmaker in his own right. Richard's hand films are performative, cinematic in their close-up framing, and careful filming in black and white 16mm film. But although each gesture is performative, it's the material, lead, that we focus on, slipping through the artist's hand as it falls downwards from an unknown source, and the pleasure and frustration of watching it repeatedly escape his grip. This makes me think of Eisenstein's diagram in his film form theory of the possible, from a Japanese avant-garde diagram of 6 possible frames for a single image, here the branch. So you can see the branch on the right with 6 possible edits, and then those 6 edits on the left, those 6 frames. I'm just putting that in so that we can see the importance of framing to Richard. In hand-lead fulcrum, a rolled-up piece of lead sits on the artist's outstretched hand, its heavy weight pressing down on his arm, which struggles to keep its position. Hands tied, as we saw earlier. In this film, the artist's hands are bound with string from which he attempts to free himself. So again, the implication is there's another person there behind the camera, and maybe the same person behind the camera tied up his wrists, persisting, wriggling his hands until the string loosens and gradually untangles to make his hands free. In all these films, we watch the material's action on the body, as opposed to the body's action on the material, as in the splash cast works. And this reverses the conventional relationship between artist and material, by which sculpture was conventionally defined. The films also echo one of the verbs Serra had written down in his verb list of 108 transitive verbs, to roll, and his 1967 sculpture Prop piece, about which he remarked, "I find myself rolling either a single roll or a double roll or a triple roll, and then we had pieces of lead that were remnants. We'd cut off a sheet. And I thought, what if I took a flat sheet of lead and tried to hold it against the wall by the force of a rolled pole? Would it hold? So we tried it, and it held." This piece is about the fundamentals of building process, Richard said, how something is held up in relation to something else. Now, doesn't that echo Eisenstein's writing on montage? Just to repeat it, it's more resistant than granite, the shot. And then Eisenstein says the conflict of volume, of mass, the conflict of depth. This framing, this hewing out, as Eisenstein said, of a piece of actuality with the axe of the lens. So in this sense, Richard's very material films articulate a paradox. On the one hand, these hand films articulate the processes of production and material conditions pointed to in Eisenstein, as well as Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception, which had just been published in English in 1962, with a high degree of corporeal and phenomenological interaction in the work. Bob Fiore had also studied Merleau-Ponty at the Sorbonne in Paris at the time they were there together. In other words, Richard's focus on the processes of production and material specificity and how they communicated a high degree of corporeal and phenomenological interaction is at the center of these films. But on the other hand, his films assert a frontality, the frame, the screen, in what could be termed quite a modernist assertion of cinematic attention. And I'd argue that this paradox really indicates the difference between Richard's rootedness in a corporality that reaffirms materiality, in contrast to the Duchampian dismantling of the gestalt of the physical object that, for example, Robert Morris's films are rooted in. As we see in Morris's films of the same period, such as Slow Motion, this is a still from Slow Motion, made in 1969 for the exhibition Art by Telephone at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. Each participating artist, including Richard, was asked to instruct the museum staff by telephone how to make the work that was to be included in the exhibition. Morris instructed that a man be filmed in slow motion, pressing his naked upper torso repeatedly against a glass door, in 7 actions that emphasized different parts of the body, including his back, his arms, his fists, his shoulders, and his face. In the resulting film, the frame of the image is positioned inside the width of the door, so we don't see the door, and the body appears to be pressing against the surface of the film or the screen. Richard's contribution to Art by Telephone, by the way, was he telephoned in instructions to make a double-screen projection. One film projector would project white light onto the wall, and the other would project a film of the projector's white light filmed previously next to the actual white light. No documentation exists, although I haven't been to the MCA's archives, it has to be said. But Richard and I talked about the possibility of remaking it, and who knows, perhaps we still can. Morris's performance flexed movements against the glass asserts the materiality of his body, as Richard's hand films do. But the movements are of a performer and not the artist, and the transparent material is engaged with more Duchampian issues of the interval, inframounts, and the proximity of the screen to surfaces of glass and mirror, to which, as Ross Krauss argued, of Morris's reflective cubes, the gestalt itself is absorbed by the constantly delayed experience of its presence as it seems to depart into infinite regress. In Hand Scraping, by Richard, there's a similar emphasis on the performative and material, but to very different ends. Bob Fiore here places the camera above a close-up of the area of the floor of Richard's studio, and the stage is set for a succinct performative action that follows, in which Richard pours the detritus from the making of one of his sculptures onto the studio floor in a pile, then, with Philip Glass, proceeds to clear it up, meticulously cleaning the floor until every last bit has been cleared away. Serra, by the way, credits Glass, who worked as a plumber, as introducing him to lead, which Glass used to seal pipes. Richard and Phil's removal of material from the floor implies a disappearance of the object altogether, a kind of film screened in reverse, asserted by the final shot of the empty studio floor. This emptiness and the erasure of the object that it implies is underlined by Richard's film's repeated assertion of the horizontal plane of the floor, an abject surface, and the opposite of the pristine surface of the gallery wall, the space of painting, which he then flips to the verticality of the screen. This assertion of horizontality, as Damisch observes, changes the notion of form, if not casting it in doubt altogether. The floor, so to speak, lowers the neutrality of the white cube of the gallery and of the modernist values it carries, and challenges this idea of the myth of human erectness and pure visuality. Horizontality, a plane outside the human body's own axis, makes pure visuality impossible. As Merleau-Ponty observed, to turn an object upside down is to deprive it of meaning. This engagement with the space extended to the gallery and was immediately understood by Richard's gallerist Leo Castelli, who showed an unprecedented responsiveness to the process-based sculptural and film work of Richard, as well as the films of Bob Morris and other artists in his gallery, including Bruce Nauman, Keith Saunier, and others, not only by making his warehouse storage available for Morris and Serra, but as Tom Hollett in his essay for Soren Grammel's show of Richard's films and videos in the Kunstmuseum Basel points out, also by dividing his new downtown loft-like gallery space in an old paper warehouse at 420 West Broadway that he'd just moved into 3 parts, including a space for ongoing film and video screenings. Doré Ashton described Leo Castelli's new gallery building as a synoptic space of knowledge and experience, a kind of multidisciplinary free academy, which also arguably connects the gallery back to the studio through the studio's early history as a study and pedagogical space in the 18th and 19th centuries in particular. So Castelli's first show in his new space in September 1971, which we can see a photograph of here, was titled Works on Film by Robert Morris, Bruce Nauman, Richard Serra, and Keith Saunier. And it was devoted to artist films, showing 4 projections side by side. Hand-catching lead, hand-scraping, frame and Tina turning, and then Richard also extended Leo's selection to include Color Aid, Paul Revere, and Morris's slow motion that we've just seen was also up there, also from that year, and Nauman's art makeup. Leo Castelli's showing of these films by everyone mentioned above and more was so extensive. They were also being shown at Anthology down the road, eventually catalyzed into a film and distribution project that he created with a gallerist and partner Iliana Sonnabend. They called it Castelli Sonnabend Tapes and Films. And this was a response to the number of artists who were making films. And actually, we at the Whitney are reconstituting Castelli Sonnabend Tapes and Films as a special collection in the museum, and with Leo and Iliana's blessing, and they gave us a couple of Morris films to start us off years ago. So that is an ongoing process. And really a kind of gathering back together of the films that were dispersed when the film and video distribution project was ended in the mid-90s. The Whitneys also bringing together the LA Rebellion, black filmmakers that were working in LA at the time, to which this is a very important kind of twin or partner. There is, by the way, hand scraping in one of the pages. So every film had its own page with a description. A Prisoner's Dilemma was made in 1974 with Leo Castelli, as well as Bruce Boyes, Spalding Gray, and others. It was made at 112 Green Street as part of the video performance exhibition there. And so just including this, because this is part of the larger thinking of Richard. Here we see Castelli, the gallerist, as a willing participant in a really striking collapsing of the space of the studio, alternative space, performance space, and the commercial gallery that Richard kind of makes through this recorded performance, whose logic and humor is communicated through very precise editing, switching between an interview in the main space and Castelli and the artist Bruce Boyce, who Castelli is imprisoned in the basement, and the video uses the concept of the prisoner's dilemma from game theory, so it's an exercise in arbitrary power, and the two protagonists, artist and dealer, perform an experiment to expose the format of commercial TV, as Richard put it, and the structures of power within the transactional system of the gallery. And Richard's stated intention for the piece was also to more broadly address the corruption of Watergate that was occurring at the time. And he said that his game show was designed to reveal TV's mendacity as epitomized by Nixon. Richard said, in 1974, people still accept what they see on their TV set as valid information. Here is a contact sheet of the extensive documentation, photographic documentation of that video performance. So just to end, I want to just mention Television Delivers People, which Richard Serra made in not only a kind of increasingly dominant TV landscape of 60s and 70s America, but also artists and filmmakers' response to that landscape. Pier Paolo Pasolini was not only one of the most important filmmakers and cultural critics of that moment, and Richard was watching his films, he was also a TV critic. And he critiqued TV as early as 1954, describing it as cultural genocide and predicting the collapse of bourgeois cultural forms into popular entertainment. Pasolini's belief that culture could operate as a subversive tool for transformative social engagement is given form in this biting critique of TV in Richard's Television Delivers People. In commercial broadcasting, I'm going to end with that quote. For Pasolini and many other filmmakers and artists at the time, including Richard, the language of cinema was a site of unresolved conflicts. It was a discursive space. It was a powerful way to resist the oppressive dominance of consumer culture because of its power as a site of inquiry and negotiation. And to quote Pasolini, it was a structure in motion, a text in progress, a dynamic form striving to be another form, in a continual state of reconstruction. So to just end, and of course here we see, you are the end product. You are the end product delivered en masse to the advertiser. Richard's video really predicts the future in a certain way. It says, in commercial broadcasting, the viewer pays for the privilege of having themselves sold. You are the product of TV, you are delivered to the advertiser, who is the customer, he consumes you. Thank you.
I was so struck by your comments about everything and found this amazing. And I was just, whose studio was that?
Oh, you mean the one with the loo and the? No idea. It's from a history of Hell's 100 Acres, an online history, and that was a studio when one of the artists arrived before they built it out.
Yeah, it struck a chord. Thank you. It struck a chord. Thank you.
Well, go and watch an Eisenstein film. I think that's another kind of thing I'd recommend because he's extraordinary, and there's a lot more to say. There's a lot more to say about these queer histories during this period, about black histories, about the connection across between what Richard and others were doing and the broader situation that we're really questioning now. And so history is constantly being, just as the 1920s were being revisited in the 60s, I think that now is also, the 20s and 30s are reappearing again. And so I think it's also an interesting moment to be rethinking some of these ideas. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chrissie. Thank you, everyone.